Welcome, everyone. Today is day 7 of the 75 Days of Partition. This is Gunita here from the 1947 Partition Archive, and today I've got Taha Shaheen here with me. We're going to be talking about the oral history work, the incredible oral history documentation work that he did in the rural and urban areas in Sindh and Punjab in Pakistan. And being an oral historian, when you're out in the field, it's quite an adventurous job because you have to do a lot of traveling. You're on your own. You've got to navigate new places, new spaces. And Taha has done all of that to bring us and to help preserve some pretty important voices. And so what else is interesting about Taha is that he's actually a student of robotics, and he used to be at NED University in Karachi. Now he's at Kyoto University in Japan. So welcome, Taha.
Thank you for having me.
So Taha, I'd love to get started to talk about the oral history first, and then we'll dig into your background and understand what drove you as a robotics student to contribute to cultural heritage. So tell us a little bit about your work in Punjab and Sindh, how you got into this work, and where all this work took you, and then we can dive into your stories a little bit.
Yeah, I think I can, if I could share my screen, I'll just show you.
Yeah.
Like you said, I'm a student of engineering. I was at university while I was working with the archive, actually. So I started working with the archive in 2016, and I worked throughout 2016 and 2017. Like you said, I was a student of electronics engineering, and I worked with robots. This is a robot that we made. We worked with the children on the autism spectrum, and we're trying to do like robot-mediated therapy with this robot.
Oh, that's amazing! Can you make that picture bigger? Is that possible? Can we see that?
I don't know.
Okay, no worries then.
Yeah. Can you see it?
Yeah.
So yeah, and then I'm currently at Kyoto University, and I'm still a student of robotics. I work at the Human Robot Interaction Lab. I'm doing my master's here from Kyoto University, and it does seem funny, like you pointed out, me as a student of robotics and engineering working on oral history projects. And the reason I was working on oral history was because it was deeply personal to me. It was my story, my grandparents' story, my parents' story. And so I'll just tell you the 3 big things that happened that led me to working with the Partition Archive. So I think I was in 4th grade when I first heard of my grandmother's story. So I think there was a homework.
Is that you in the photo?
Yeah, so I'm in the blue, and that's my brother in the brown, and that's my grandmother in the pink. I don't know who's on the bed behind us. Yeah, but so this is a photograph from 2008. I think I was in 8th grade.
Oh wow.
So I like I said, so I think it was 4th grade maybe, when there was this homework assignment where we had to find somebody to interview who had migrated from India. And back then there used to be a lot more people who were alive and you could interview. And anyway, so I went to my father to ask him for help, and then he told me that his mother had actually migrated from India, and I didn't know this. And so then we went to my grandmother, and we I heard her story for the first time. And I think parts of it my dad was also hearing for the first time. And it was a very emotional story. I'm going to get into it later in the presentation.
Yeah, we're looking forward to it.
Yeah. So, and then the second thing that happened was in 2011 when I went to India myself. And I wasn't able to go to where my grandmother was from, but it was still a very huge, it had a huge impact on me and how I thought. And back then, before I went to India, I used to think of it was this common perception that we have, like India enemy, India bad, Pakistan good, sort of like so. But it like changed completely when I went to India. I met the people there. It's funny, like even in Japan, some of my very closest friends are Indian.
Where did you
And
go to in India?
so I was there for 4 days. There was some visa issues, so we were supposed to be there for 10 days, but we had to come back early. And
And what
I
did
went
you
to,
do there?
sorry.
What was the reason for
Oh
visiting?
yeah, so I was a Boy Scout, and so there was a content, like 40 of us went to India to meet our counterparts in India. So we were in Delhi for 2 days, and we were in Haryana for 2 days. And yeah,
Fascinating.
this is a photograph of me standing at Wagah with the soldiers. These are Indian soldiers. So this is I just crossed over when this photograph was taken. And yeah. And then third thing that happened was, so in 2013, tragically, my aunt passed away. This is a photograph of my aunt with me on my first birthday. This is
Oh,
us cutting the
I'm
cake.
sorry to hear that.
Yeah. So I mean, it was a very sudden thing to happen, and it sort of, I don't know, it was I was suddenly hit with this realization that, how experiences and memories just disappear when people pass away. And so I think these three things had me primed. And then in 2016, a friend of mine, a very dear friend of mine, told me about the archive. And so there had been attempts by other family members before to try to sort of preserve uh, the history of our ancestors, people who had migrated, but nothing as organized or as thorough as what the archive was doing. So in 2016, I started working with the archive. This is me at an event in 2017
I
where
remember that
I
event.
was asked to speak. Yes.
This was at Habib University, right?
No, this one's at Sakhar. There was
Oh,
one at
right.
Habib
Okay.
University just before this one. Yeah.
And Fakra helped organize this one,
Yes,
if I
yes. Fakhra
recall.
Hassan was there. She was the organizer, and I also spoke there. So this was my journey.
Yeah,
I
thanks for
I
sharing that.
Yeah. I mean, so I was born in Karachi, and so that was where I did most of half of my interviews. 40 interviews I did in Karachi. But my parents are both from Punjab. So my grandparents migrated from the Indian Punjab to the Pakistani Punjab, and then my parents migrated from Punjab to Karachi. And so I grew up in Karachi, and 40 half of my interviews were done in Karachi. And then I was very interested in recording the stories of my family, and all of them lived in Punjab. So in December of 2017, my mother and my grandfather and me, we went to all of these different small villages and small cities where
That's
all of my yeah, family members were, and we found all of these, like I was we interviewed my grandfather's brothers and sisters and cousins and like everybody, but then we also interviewed neighbors that had migrated with them and had similar stories. And we there were so many stories that I felt very connected to because they were my family's story, my story. And so I did around 40 interviews in a month in December because there were so many people to interview.
wow, that's incredible. So you're going to show us some of those interview
Yes,
photos now?
yes. So
Okay.
I'm going to share with you two stories. So one is of my paternal family.
Okay.
And so on the left, you see Hashmat Bibi. She is my father's mother. And on the right, you see her sister. They both migrated together. I was fortunate enough to able to interview both of them. Ghafoora Bibi has since passed away. Um, and so their story was one of loss, but then of reunion. uh, they had no plans of leaving there where they lived, but they had to leave because they would have been attacked otherwise. And in the kafila, in the caravan, they were attacked by armed people, and their older brother and their mother were killed.
And
And
where
they
did they
had
migrate from in
they migrated from there's a small village near Faridkot. It's called Tuddi in Punjabi.
Tuddi?
Tuddi.
Interesting, because I spent all my growing up summers in Faridkot
Oh.
and nearby villages. So that's so interesting.
So my grandmother actually on the left, she could remember like the streets and like everything. So we actually pulled up a map and we were trying to find out like where she actually lived. Of course, the place has changed completely, but it was an interesting thing. And so their older brother and their mother were essentially killed, and then they had to leave their family, and the rest of the family migrated to Pakistan. The what was like interesting about this story was their mother and brother had not actually died and were picked up by the army and brought to Pakistan separately. And they both thought that Hashmat Bibi and the rest of the family had perished. So there were these two parts of the family that were living very close together, actually, in different villages for 6 months before they found each other accidentally, and they were reunited. So it was a story of reunion in the end.
Wow, that's incredible. So when were they reunited?
6 months after they migrated. So
They were living in refugee camps in the
so
meanwhile?
nobody lived in refugee camps because they had relatives here. So they just moved into relatives' houses, and then the relatives just helped them out. So they were
Okay.
called panahgir back in the day. So people looking for refuge. So refugees, and then people just helped them out.
Wow.
And it was actually a relative of theirs who would go to the train station every day to look for people he knew, and he recognized their brother and was like, "Oh, let's
Wow, that's incredible. And then, so you documented more stories in when you were traveling to meet your family members as well, right?
I I did I so the next section, like, are you talking about the next bunch of stories, or are you
Oh yeah,
asking
I
like
haven't seen your slide deck, so I don't know. I'm
okay,
just
so
asking in general.
yeah, so no, I recorded stories faster when I was in Punjab. Like I recorded 40 stories in Punjab in a month, and it took me a long time to record 40 stories in Karachi. So it was easier because I had all these relatives in Punjab, and my grandfather and my mother helped. So we would be on one motorcycle just traveling from village to village, and like there was also my uncle would bring relatives to his house for me to interview. So he would go out on his motorcycle and bring a relative in, and then he would go out and bring a different relative in.
Oh
And
wow,
so,
that's incredible.
so
So
I
what
was
were
just
some of your big learnings from speaking to so many people?
I think the learning. I mean, I was learning about my family. I had never heard of, like, some of the relatives I didn't even know existed. So I was learning about how big my family was, how deep the stories went, how everything was so connected. Like entire villages had moved together. So the neighbor knew how they'd migrated, and like the person across the street was also a migrant from the same place. It was
And where did they
amazing.
settle in West Punjab?
Lots of people came to Bhurewala initially, but then they dispersed from there. Different families went to different places. So some were in Harunabad, others went to Chishtiya, Khanpur.
And
Khanpur was where my mother and father were both born.
what district are those in?
I think it's the Khanpur district. I'm not sure of the districts. Yeah.
Okay, that's really interesting. That so people from Faridkot district migrated to these regions
Mhm.
together.
Yes. So the next set of stories I want to talk about is my maternal family. So these are all four siblings, that the surviving siblings at the time when I
Wow.
was able to interview them. The one on the rightmost was born in Pakistan, so I didn't interview her for the archive, but the rest of the siblings I was able to interview. Two of these siblings have since passed away. On the bottom right, you see my maternal grandfather, my mother's father, and so their story was also interesting, close to my heart, because of course they were my direct relatives. So they migrated from Langyana, all of them together, and they actually had no plans of migrating. Like they just stayed, and it was I think it was, according to them, it was a Sikh majority village, and the Sikhs actually protected them from any attacks, and so they had no need to worry. But then the the leaders of the village, they gathered and they sort of collectively decided that it would be better if they migrated, and so they prayed Eid ul Azha prayers together, and with the Sikhs protecting them in the village, and then they left a few days after that.
Wow.
And so they came without any events. They were protected by some armed militia or army or something, and they were able to migrate over.
Wow, that's incredible.
They moved to Hafizwala. They already had relatives there, so they didn't have to like set up from the ground up, and they were able to establish themselves relatively quickly. And one very interesting thing I want to share, I think Anachal is going to share the video, let me just tell you what the video is about. So during this journey on my journey to learn about my family, there was this one thing. So my mother has always celebrated her birthday on this certain day, but we have never actually been able to verify if that is actually her birthday. And so my mother insisted always that there was a letter somewhere which had her birthday in it. And so when we went to Punjab to interview people, like we were very interested in finding this letter. So we looked all over and we were able to recover a bunch of old letters. And so this is my uncle reading that letter in which my mother's birthday is mentioned. So
खत का जवाब क्यों नहीं दिया और शमीम अख्तर की गोदी लड़की है शमीम अख्तर की लड़की है शमीम अख्तर की गोदी लड़की है और लड़की बीमार रहती है और कोई फिक्र की बात नहीं है और लड़की माँ का दूध नहीं पीती देखा मेरा और सब खैरियत से है लड़की की पैदाइश 72 की है सही बनाती हूँ ना मैंने यही से पढ़ा था
That was so fascinating. That's how she found out when her birthday was.
I mean, when she was young, she must have read that letter. So she always insisted that it was on this day, and there was no official proof of that. Wow. And this was a letter written by my grandmother's brother to my grandfather, telling him that he has a daughter now.
And so what kind of memories do the elders hold about where they came from?
So most of my elders never had intended to migrate. So it was like this bittersweet thing that they bittersweet feelings. My paternal grandmother's father had always intended to go back. So even until the day he died, he was insisting that they were going to go back. So he never claimed the land that he was entitled to, and so then his son had to scramble to find documents in land. So it was like a very bittersweet feeling that they had, and some of them wanted to go back. Some of them had no intention of going back, but always remembered their birthplaces fondly.
Yeah, and one of the things that I think we've noticed from most of the oral histories we've documented is that a majority of the people thought the migration was temporary. Mm-hmm. People mostly left their things behind. Sometimes they didn't have an option, they just had to run. But most people thought they were going to go back. And of course, we have interviewed some people who did go back to their ancestral homes. But that was a very common theme. And I can't imagine living your full life thinking you're going to go back to your ancestral home and not being able to do it.
Another interesting thing was that, so my, let me show you. Okay, so anyway, so one of my grandfather's brothers. Oh, here. So on the bottom left, you see Haji Abdul Ghani. He was married at the time when he migrated. He was young. He was maybe 15, and his wife was 9. So they didn't live together. But so his wife was migrating with his own family, and his wife was abducted. So they didn't know where she went, and that was another interesting part of how families were separated. And I mean, she was recovered pretty soon, but we had another family member who came back 2 years after the partition. Nobody knew where she went.
And where did she go when you guys found her?
She didn't want to talk about it, so
Okay.
I tried asking her, but so the common story in the family is that she was kidnapped and then she had a child with somebody else, but she had to abandon the child when she was found.
Wow.
But she didn't say any of this.
And
So
she was found where, in India?
in India.
And then she was taken by the military.
Yes, brought back, and her husband had already remarried, but so they took her in still, and so she had her own kids with the husband, and they live still with her.
Incredible. That's incredible.
There were so many stories. There was one story where I was so struck. He was a neighbor of one of my grandfathers, and he was telling me how. So his story was of his family migrating and then eventually crossing the border. But then he remembers after they crossed the border that he had an older brother who had passed away just before they crossed the border. He didn't remember an older brother.
Wow.
That was so interesting because like he had forgotten that he had an older brother. He just remembered it
when you were doing the
when I was doing the interview. Yeah.
Because of the interview. So the interview process also changes the people that you interview. It impacts both you and them.
Yes.
Are there other stories you'd like to share? Is from your work in Karachi, for example?
In Karachi, I don't have any on my slide, but I can mention some. So
Yeah.
in Karachi, a lot of the people I interviewed were not my relatives, so they had different stories. And because I'd not grown up listening to stories of people migrating because they wanted to, it was fascinating for me. So there was this person who I interviewed who had graduated from the same university I was studying in, and so my university is older than Pakistan. So
Which
so
NED University?
University it's from 1921. So that person had fought in the World War and then had resigned from the army and then had come to Karachi because he thought it was economically he was going to do better in Karachi, and his family had not migrated with him. And so there were a lot of stories of people who were educated and they knew what they were doing in Karachi. But from my family, that was not the case.
Wow. Well, what are your some of your biggest personal takeaways from how did it help you grow the oral history work?
I think it was important that I did it. I'm very proud and I feel privileged and honored that I was able to do it. I think so many of these people that I interviewed have passed away since, and if I'd waited a year to graduate and then do these stories or thought about doing it later, I would not have been able to do it. So I'm very happy that I did these stories, and it was a personal journey for me as well. So I learned a lot about myself.
Was it challenging to do both, to do interviews and your schoolwork?
Yes, especially in 2017, because that's the last year of university. I had to make a project to graduate, and that was very difficult to juggle both things. So that is why in December 2016 was when I did a lot of the stories, because that was during winter vacations. I didn't have anything from school to do.
And what were some of the biggest challenges you faced, especially when you were out in the rural areas?
There was language was one, because so my Punjabi is not good, and they spoke. So I understand Punjabi perfectly fine, but when I speak, it sounds weird. So it was sometimes it was difficult. So I always had my mother or my uncle or my grandfather with me to help, and sometimes people would because of course there were some people wouldn't let us interview their parents or grandparents because they were just afraid that they were going to become sick after reliving the memories. And so that was another challenge. Transportation was a very difficult challenge. Some of the places were so difficult to get to. So like on a motorcycle, you had to travel on these thin pagdandi, thin dirt roads to get to the place where I was supposed to interview somebody.
And you took all your equipment with you on the motorcycle? It was just you by yourself, or did you have people accompanying you?
My uncle, my grandfather, my mother. Mother was with me. In Punjab, my mother and my uncle and my grandfather. In Karachi, I was mostly on my own, but Karachi is easier to travel.
So it was like a family exercise. You guys did
It was a family
together as a
exercise.
family. That's amazing.
So it was so funny. We had mobilized the entire family. Like everybody in every village was trying to find people who they knew had migrated or knew stories. And so we were receiving calls from all over Punjab, like please come and interview this person. And some of those places we couldn't go to because they were too far, or like it would have taken too long.
Yeah.
So some people I was not able to interview because of this.
Okay. Hopefully somebody else was able to get to them.
Hopefully, I don't think so. Yes, hopefully.
Thank you so much for joining us today. Do you have any other parting thoughts you'd like to share?
It's just
on remembering partition and how the way forward.
I think I'm just happy that I did this. So I think I'm going to be very proud of this thing I did for the rest of my life. It's one of the things that I'm most happy about.
That's amazing. And what do you think? How do you think these stories can impact the future?
I think because like I'm going to speak from my personal family. Maybe any kids I have will not have my grandparents to tell them the stories, and so these recorded stories that I have of my family will serve as our history, and my any descendants that we have will be able to learn from them, hopefully.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thanks so much for joining us today, and for everybody else, please tune in again tomorrow for 75 Days of Partition. We're doing an event every single day to commemorate the 75th anniversary and the 75 days between June 3rd, when the Mountbatten Plan for Partition was announced, and August 17th, when the Radcliffe Line was announced. So thanks, Taha, for joining us on day 7. So we'll look forward to seeing everyone again tomorrow. See you. Bye.
Thank you so much for having me. Bye.
Of course, our pleasure.